All right, we're a couple of minutes past noon. Do you want to get started, Asher?
Okay, I'll mute myself.
I noticed that we're already live on the Facebook page as well with Sharon.
There we are.
So I can start. So I welcome everybody to our program today. Just want to thank Sid Marglese and Paul Graif for participating. And Paul, I'm going to hand it off to you because everybody wants to hear the two of you.
Okay, well, thank you, Asher. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Graif. I've been a member of the Sharon for all 50 years of my life. My grandfather was Jacob Lewin, who was the Parnas for a quarter century. I've been in the radio, TV, and newspaper business now for 30 years. I'm currently the news and sports director at K1037 Radio in Ottawa. This isn't about me. Just to let everybody know before we get started, I do have some breaking news from Israel. I don't know if you've heard that Netflix and Yahoo are merging. Moving their headquarters to Jerusalem, and they're calling it Net and Yahoo. All right, in all seriousness,
that hurts.
I first met our guest 32 years ago when he so graciously welcomed me into his home. Unfortunately for me, he'd already retired from full-time radio, but I knew right away that he would have been tough but fair to work with and for, someone who could have helped me become a better reporter much, much sooner. Sidney Marglese is a member of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame after an illustrious career, mostly at CJAD in Montreal and with Standard Broadcasting in Ottawa. A career that began in 1957 and ended as a reporter and host in 1987. However, there was far more that went on during that career, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Sid, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Paul.
Really a pleasure to get to talk to you this way as opposed to just in a friendly atmosphere normally, but this will keep friendly, of course. I just want to let our audience know that we will open up the floor to questions or the Zoom to questions afterwards as well. So Sid, let's just start off with, you know, such an amazing career in the growth of radio. What was your most memorable story to cover and why?
Well, I guess the most memorable would have been the TCA crash of 1963 in St. Therese. It was most memorable, I guess, because it really launched me after several years of being a reporter. It launched me into a career that brought me fame, not necessarily fortune, but as you well know, if you enjoy what you're doing while you're working, money is not the major thing. I can't complain about having done well over the years, but I certainly didn't become wealthy, although I've certainly enjoyed life and have been very satisfied over the years.
Let's talk about that horrible crash that day of the plane. What, 118 people died, you know, shortly after takeoff as it crashed in St. Therese within what, 10 or 15 minutes after it took off. Tell us how it all worked for you as a reporter. And in 1963, people need to remember, of course, we didn't have anywhere near the technology that we have now.
Well, that's quite true. But let me start off by saying, first of all, I'm a hunch player. And I was at home about to sit down for dinner with my wife, my late wife, Pearl, when the phone rang and Vince Rowe, one of the editors of CJAD, who was on duty at the time, said to me, "Sid, there's been an explosion of some kind up in St. Therese." I said, "Okay, Vince, how did you find out?" And he told me a lady had called in. In those days, we had what was called $1 a hauler. People would call in with news tips and they get $1 for it. And at the end of the week, they get a prize ranging up to $80 in coinciding with the station's identification on the dial 800. 800 was the end of the year prize. And so I left my house or my apartment on Kent Avenue. For those people who know Montreal well, I lived on Kent behind the Wilderton Shopping Center. And I got into the mobile, which I used to take home, and started started driving northward while Vince would call a lady back to find out a little more precisely where in St. Therese. And she explained to him near the BMK plant. Well, I knew very well where the BMK plant was. That was a rug company just off Highway 11 north of St. Rose. So I said to Vince, tell the autoroute police I'm not stopping. In those days, there were tolls on the autoroute, and I went up the Laurentian autoroute, cut over then exit 9. I'll always remember the exit to Highway 11, which is now 117, and continued up the road. And as I was on that highway north of St. Rose, there was a guy standing there waving a flashlight. It turned out it was the lone policeman of the area, his name, Noel Obertin. And I stopped and I said, where is the explosion? And he pointed to his right, which was my left, and I could see flames in the woods. And he guided me into a driveway. I drove down that driveway, the farmer's driveway, till the end where it was his house. I got out, I put on my boots and coats and walked out into the rubble to see there was fire and pieces of airline and unfortunately pieces of human beings and all kinds of debris. I walked back to my car, turned on my transmitter to talk to the people at CJAD to tell them what it was. They interrupted the program. The late Paul Reed was on the air, and Paul and I started the discussion. I started explaining what I saw. One of the things, Paul, and you'll appreciate this, having done play-by-play yourself, my objective all the time was to try and put the listener in my shoes, seeing what I saw through my eyes. And so I described this horrific scene. Paul would ask me questions, I'd answer him, and after a few minutes, they would play what was called the dirge music, which is music, funeral style music, to give me a break to try and get more information. And I did. I gathered from the people who were in the near area who saw what had happened or heard what had happened. And then I would come back on the air and explain what was going on. So,
how did, Sid, sorry to interrupt you, but how did the mobile work? You know, the technology in the day. You said.
Well, in those days we had shortwave transmitters,
right.
A shortwave unit which was attached to the car, and you threw a switch, and it sent a shortwave transmission to the radio station tower or receiver, which happened to be at the top of the Polytechnique at the Université de Montréal on the north side of the mountain. On the south side of the mountain, it was at another location.
And what was your range on that? Were you attached to the car by hardwire? Or?
Yeah, at that point I had to be in the car or adjacent to the car with the microphone.
Okay.
Subsequent to it, just as an aside, Lloyd Sharkey, who was then one of the technical people at CJAD, in conjunction with Motorola, developed what was called the carrier-operated relay system, and that allowed me later on in life to use a portable unit to transmit back to the car, which would repeat the transmission back to the station, which was useful, very useful in 1968 at the St. Jean-Baptiste riot. For those people who remember, my car was almost overturned, but I was not in the car, although some people thought I might have been at the time. But getting away from the TCA crash, I was able to continuously broadcast. I also, thanks to the farmer, and I don't remember his name, he allowed me the use of his phone, his landline. And I had to get on his landline, and it was one of those party line operations in those days. And I got the operator on the line and explained to her that she had to clear the line and hold it open for me as I talked to the people at TCA at Dorval. And the people at TCA at Dorval were giving me information as I was telling them about this horrendous site and how people were coming to steal things. And that's really what I guess the most emotional part, where I call the people ghouls and scavengers. I don't know how those words came to me, but they did.
Were there no police officers on scene who were?
No, Overton was the only man. Remember, it was, I should back up and say it was a drizzly, rainy night. There was heavy traffic on the Laurentian auto route, people going up to the Laurentians. The roadway at Highway 11 got clogged with some local people. Fortunately, as the evening progressed, they managed to get some reserve military folks from a nearby Camp Bouchard, and they came to shoo the people away and to try and recover the parts of airplanes that people were carrying away in their arms, under their arms.
Wow.
And it was just incredible, because the scene, and this isn't great for lunchtime, but it included pieces of bodies hanging from trees. It was a devastation. You got to remember, here is a huge, monstrous DC-8 crashing right into the ground and blowing up.
How do you put, and I think people want to know this, that, you know, we're often on, you know, on scenes of things, unfortunately, that are like that, of murders, of beatings, of, you know, horrible crashes. How do you put images like that out of your mind and continue on?
Put it this way, you don't, although I did, I think initially, because you're so dog tired by the time you get home, you go to sleep. But Merle would tell me a few days later, I would be talking in my sleep about the crash. And I don't normally talk in my sleep. But the vividness has gone, but the memory will always be there. I haven't relived it as such, because I was not implicated in the same way as victims' families were. But much of this was revived a few years back when one of the sons wrote a book, and he was calling around to interview people who had something to do with the crash. And of course, he contacted me. I also have to tell you, there is a little museum in St. Therese where they have some of the parts of the aircraft on exhibit, and a couple of my pictures, not by me, but of me on the scene, which happened to be taken.
We could talk for the entire hour about this, but I'm sure people want to hear more about other things. You mentioned 68 and the Saint Jean-Baptiste riot. You were at the reviewing stand with the Prime Minister at that point. Describe that scene.
Well, it was very common to be covering demonstrations, riots, what have you. As you may recall, the 60s were tumultuous times in Montreal, and that Saint Jean-Baptiste evening, which was the eve of a federal election, Pierre Trudeau was in the reviewing stand, which was in front of the Montreal Public Library on Sherbrooke, where Cherrier meets Sherbrooke. And he, Trudeau and Drapeau and others were in the reviewing stand when the demonstrators developed a riot. Everyone got up to scurry to safety except Pierre Trudeau, who sat there just like that, looking out at the crowd, not giving a damn.
What about Sidney Marglese?
I was in front of it, perhaps 15 or 20 feet in front of it. They were throwing rocks which were going over my head, and I was describing it. And as I was describing it, the police came along. In those days, they used horses, men on horseback, very effective. They started pushing the crowd away, and they started pushing them up Cherrier. Well, my car was parked on Cherrier, and I was using the repeater in the car to broadcast. I was my little 5-watt portable from Motorola, and as I was broadcasting, you could see my car was up on 2 or 3 wheels, and but I was fortunate in a sense. I had a siren attached to the car, in part for alarm purposes, because of demonstrations and other things that had occurred earlier in the 60s. And when the siren went off, the police on horses went charging. So the rioters dropped my car and kept on running. So that saved the car, to Ford Motor Company's delight, because it was their car really. And that was one of the incidents that you can't forget also. I was describing something in which I guess I was peripherally involved. My car was there.
Which was not the style of the day for reporters, right? To describe how it affected you or how you were involved in the story.
Well, it was one of those rare circumstances. I had other occasions where I had a direct involvement. One was in Trois-Rivières. The Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale was having its convention, and I was there to report on it. Well, as it turned out, they didn't like me too much because I was an English reporter. Now, a little earlier, there was a riot at the 7-Up plant in the town of Mount Royal. At that 7-Up plant, Walter Boyle, the late Walter Boyle, who was the chief of police of the town of Mount Royal, remember it had its own police force. Walter came over to me and said, "Do you know any of those demonstrators?" And I said, "Yeah, we see them regularly." And I named a few. Well, that, to my chagrin, turned out to be not a fatal error, but an error in the sense of letting him be seen speaking to me. Because at the RIN meeting, someone got up at the podium and denounced me, that I was a traitor, that I was giving out information to the police and so on. Well, all I did was tell them the name of someone who, it was Angela Ferretti, if I remember correctly. See, you're waking up my memories. And so they decided I had to leave the meeting, and they threw me out. However, everybody else in the media decided, well, do we walk out or not? So they came out, led by Norman DePoe, the late Norm DePoe of CBC.
Mm-hmm.
Then they all went back in while I stayed outside to look at my car, which had its tires slashed.
Oy.
So I had to call for a tow truck to make arrangements to get the car out of the area. And I sort of stayed at the background on the side and was able to report on it.
Well, before I open up the Zoom to questions, who is the most important person or the most memorable person you've ever interviewed, and why?
Well, if you're talking domestically, I could say a series of prime ministers and premiers. If you're talking internationally, I did have the opportunity to interview Golda Meir and Menachem Begin, both in Israel on 2 separate occasions.
And you also got to cover the 1979 Sadat Begin visit in Israel, right?
Yes, I did. I was there. I did not get to interview either of them at that time. But what happened was I was based in Ottawa in those days, and the late Ted Blackman, who was program director at CJAD, called me and said, "Sid, we want someone to go to Israel. It's an important story for Montreal, for the Jewish community, and you've been there, you know them. Would you go?" And I said, "Ted, get me on an airplane first class so I can sleep, and I'm on the way." He said, "I'll call you back in 15 minutes. Sure enough, he called back and said, "I have a ticket for you on Alitalia out of Mirabel. Alitalia, Mirabel to Rome, Rome to Tel Aviv, and you're on the way. Do you need money?" And so I said, "No, I'll take care of everything else." I called the RCMP out at Mirabel and said, "Listen, I need some pictures because you have to come with pictures." I checked with the Israeli embassy. Sure enough, I drove over to Mirabel. They took some pictures for me, so I had those little passport-style pictures, got on the plane, flew first class to Rome to Tel Aviv, arrived in Tel Aviv. I knew my way around. I took a taxi to Jerusalem, came there, little incidents with the hotel. We had a hotel booked, except they kicked us out of the King David right away because the mistake was that they took bookings and then realized they had to leave it open for the visiting Egyptians. So we ended up at the hotel. I don't remember the name, but it was run by CP. A lot of people who might be watching now will remember the tall hotel opposite Kikar Sfarad. And we ended up there with a great facility, walked over to the concert location. There was a concert hall where they had a big press headquarters set up. Everybody was given their own telephone. In those days, you broadcast by telephone.
Yeah.
And we had bypassed the whole international network. You just had to press a certain number of numbers, and you were right through to Canada and to Montreal. And that's where I met Clark Todd, who was working for NBC. Clark is an ex-Montreal, actually he was a Newfie, who worked in Montreal at CJAD and went off to the Middle East to be a freelancer and was doing work for NBC.
Oh.
So Clark and I teamed up together, and I was, for example, at the terminal, I was inside and he was outside on the tarmac, and we could talk to each other with little old-fashioned walkie-talkies, and we were both able to broadcast our reports. And I was both on our standard broadcast news network, which I was running here at home, and with NBC. And unfortunately, Clark was subsequently killed a few years later in Lebanon.
Wow. I was, speaking of violence, you were around in the days of the FLQ and reporting on the terrorism that began in the early mid 60s. And then, of course, culminated with the October crisis and the killing of Laporte. One of the things that you got that nobody else did was an interview with Jasper Cross, the British Trade Commissioner, who was kidnapped.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a background to it. You see, I interviewed Cross a year later in London. He welcomed me because the night that Pierre Laporte's body was found, and we broke the news, I was at the station. Rick Lechner was in St. Hubert. It's a long story to go with it, but I was on the air in the studio explaining about Laporte's body being found and so on, and background. And I kept saying, we've had rumors, but there's no confirmation that Jasper Cross's body had been found in Rawdon, because somehow or other this rumor started, but the boys in the newsroom were passing information to me that the provincial police had confirmed that there's no such thing in Rawdon. So I kept repeating that, in addition to reporting on Laporte's finding and his background. I knew Pierre Laporte, so it was relatively easy to talk about him. So when I kept saying that Cross had not been found, that there's no word on him, over at CBC, our friends on television who were listening to me heard in the background a fellow scream out, "Marglese says Cross is still alive." That voice was Conrad Black, who subsequently became the owner of CJAD for a while. But Conrad was friends with the folks at CBC and was over there. And I guess he felt if I said it, it was legit. And it was true. I so-called kept him alive by saying that Cross had not been found at that time. Gorman, I forget his first name, the head of British Airways in Montreal at the time, John Gorman, I think it was, he offered me a trip to to London to meet Cross, and I went over there, took a vacation at the same time, but met Jasper Cross, who was working for the British government at the time. And he's still alive. I believe he's almost 100, if not 100, and he's alive as far as I know. So he was famous, but in our news cycle, he was known at the time. If you talk to someone now and ask them who Jasper Cross was, they wouldn't know.
not necessarily. What was that interview like? I mean, you were the only one to get it a year later.
Well, it was basically a background interview, how he felt at the time. It was quite interesting, and then what he was doing at that current time, working in the British trade.
Well, what I want to do for our audience is those of you who have questions, if you can go into the chat and just say you have a question, then we can go in order that way. In the meantime, I will continue, or just, do your hand raising icon in there, as that'll be fine in order to get questions to Sid. You went on after retiring from Muzak, which was Standard Sound, 1984 to 1999. And then you also spent 12 straight years as a municipal councillor in the town of Mount Royal. What was the biggest difference for you going from broadcasting to politics?
Well,
other side of it.
Look, Paul, I always felt I wanted to give back something to the community in which I live. During the years that I was a broadcaster on the air, I didn't take any active participation in any kind of politics, municipal, provincial, or federal. But when I came back to Montreal in 1984, and all I was doing on air was a program with religious leaders, a program which I originated in Ottawa, which they asked me to do with CJAD at that time, I felt I could get involved in the community. So I got involved in political activity federally, because my wife Merle at the time became the right hand to Sheila Finestone. I ended up being the president of the Mount Royal Liberal Association for better than a dozen years. But I lived in the town of Mount Royal for many years, and I felt it would be very nice to get involved in the community. And I was asked, and I said yes, I would run for a municipal election in 1987.
Sid, sorry to cut you off, but were you concerned of a Sidney Marglese coming and questioning you as a politician?
No, it didn't bother me. And people did come and question. I have clippings from the days in Mount Royal as to why certain things were done. And same thing federally, I was involved in the sense of helping Sheila seek re-election. I have to tell you, my friend Lawrence Bergman might be listening in on this, but Lawrence came to discuss with me and Merle whether he should run in politics, and I was like the rabbi discouraging a convert or a would-be convert. I said, "You're out of your mind, Lawrence." And we explained to him everything that we knew about politics as to what the toll is on your family life and so on. And he came back some days later and said, "I'm running. Thank you for your assistance. Now will you help me get elected?" And yes, I did run his campaign in that year, and he stayed on for 20 years.
Okay, I want to get to questions from our audience. Asher Tannenbaum is first, our Reverend at Shara Zion. Asher, unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Paul. So Sid, you have a volume of history to share. It's very, very so interesting. So question, in your career, vast career, have you experienced any anti-Semitism?
That's an interesting question. I was asked that recently and wrote in the Canadian Jewish Record. No. And I'll tell you, there may have been some, but it never was openly said to me. I certainly didn't feel it in work. I explained, and I'll explain to our audience, I was not the first Jewish person at CJAD, although I was the first well-known Jewish person. Lee Fortune, Glick was his real name, from Ottawa, used to do an afternoon program in the 1950s on CJAD, and then he moved over to CBC. I was the first openly Jewish person at CJAD, and then Rick Lechner and Peter Sherman joined my team in the newsroom. We were nicknamed the Jewish Mobile Squad, or the Mobile Squad for the Gentiles. But and subsequently, there have been many Jewish broadcasters. You also have to know that in that period, there were a number of Jewish broadcasters who owned property. Jack Titleman owned CKVL. There was in Hamilton, in Calgary, Soskin in Calgary, I forget the name now. It's Fred Kaufman's father-in-law in Hamilton, and there were many other Jews who got involved in broadcasting and subsequently on the air as well. And today you do have a number of Jewish people on the air at CJAD as well.
Well, thank you for the question, Asher. Next, we're going to go to Mark Bolgach. Sorry, Mark. Please unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Hi, Sidney. I'm from Montreal. I live in Toronto now. You are one of the first broadcast journalists that I can recall. I went on to a career at CBC in Montreal, and now then went to the National in Toronto. I just wondered, I don't want to ask a big question, but what's the most troubling thing you find now when you watch the news? What troubles you about the industry?
Well, you have to divide the industry into its segments. One of the problems today is what Trump calls fake news, because what we've had in the last number of years with the various forms of media sprouting, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, anyone can become a reporter, whether they have any ability or not, whether they really care about the truth or not. A rumor becomes a fact to many people. And you know the old expression, if you tell a lie often enough, people will think it's true. So that's really the troublesome thing in the media today, that unfortunately, it's not what I'll call the professional media that are a problem, it's the amateur media that have become a problem.
If I could jump in there for a bit of counterpoint on that, Sid, the mainstream media, as we're so called, is also a part of a problem because of the proliferation in the 90s of Fox News and very slanted media. Fox now, because Trump has turned on them, it's a bit of a different story there. It's slightly less orthodox, conservative, if you want to, put that term on them.
Well, you're right, Paul, but that's also part of an evolution that started, I'd say, in the 70s and 80s in Europe, where opinion started filtering into news reporting, and particularly in the newspapers. Fox is an offspring of the British style of reporting, and the National Post in Canada is in part an offspring of the British style, where they merge or meld opinion and commentary with news. And sometimes people don't differentiate when they're reading it or seeing it, even though it might be marked in very small letters, opinion or commentary at the top. But that's part of a problem that has evolved. It developed also, or let's say, grew into the French media in France to start with, and then into the French media in Quebec. And that's why you have the Journal de Montréal and Journal de Québec are extremely influential, because much of what is written in those papers is opinion and commentary rather than fact. It's a problem.
It is, and now with algorithms on social media, we're only seeing in our feeds what we already believe in, and it only reinforces that kind of thing. One of the questions is, because you covered so many controversial things, and during the Quiet Revolution, I would imagine that did you ever find yourself in danger? This is a question from Elliot Levine. Was your life ever threatened?
Did I ever find myself in danger? Well, only once, really, did I feel that I was in danger, which was during the Murray Hill riot. I was broadcasting in English, standing on the street as the rioters were setting fire to the Murray Hill garage, and where there was gunshots, and an undercover policeman was killed, and some of the rioters were running at me, and one of them started shouting en anglais, kill him, type of thing. Well, I was a little afraid when he sort of rushed at me, I used my microphone, which is an old EV635. If you remember, Paul, this long metal piece, and I hit him in the chin when he went sort of lurched at me. He backed away, and I ran off the other way towards my car, which was being driven by one of my colleagues who was parked a few blocks away, and we got in and scooted away. Other than that, I was on a number of occasions at fires where I didn't really think that I was in danger, but only subsequently did some people say, you know, you were nuts. You were too close. Rick is even worse. If he's watching, Rick Lefner would go into the building. I would only be on the front of the building. Yeah, we put ourselves in danger unknowingly. And if you ask, would I do it again? Probably not.
Knowing what you know now, hindsight is 20/20, right?
Right.
Here's a question from Irving Burstein. How did you get started doing what you do or did?
Well, I got started in a very strange way, really. I was living on Kent, west of Côte d'Ivoire. When it came to going to high school, I finished at Israel, and going to high school, where I lived was not the area for Strathcona, although they took Strathcona kids in after the local kids in the district were accepted. So I went to Strathcona along with another group of guys, and we lined up, and at 2 in the afternoon, they said to us, sorry, all your spaces are full. You'll have to go to the High School of Montreal, which was on University, now Face School. So I went to High School of Montreal. High School of Montreal in that year used to let out at 2:30 because there was nowhere to go for lunch. You had 30 or 40 minutes for lunch. So 2:30, I said, you know, there's this radio station thing that they had a audience participation, teenagers from 4:05 to 5. It's a good way to kill a good part of the afternoon. And I started going over to the radio station from University over to Mountain Street. And I started going to the program, and I said, this is an interesting type of occupation. And then I guess I can use the term, I hung out at the radio station in the summertime on a Saturday. They had a program out at Belmont Park, which doesn't exist anymore. But for those older folks of us remember, they had this live program. And I ended up doing some Coca-Cola commercials because the guy in charge at the time, the late Art Leonard, he was there before Mike Stevens, but after Bob Harvey. And Art didn't really want to do the program anyway, so he gave me the commercials to read. And that started me off on an interesting career. And I moved into the station as call it the Nuchschlepper, a hanger-on, whatever you want to call it, while I was still at school. And I would start in the newsroom. I'd be writing little blurbs. I was encouraged by people like Hammy Grant and Al Colley to write these news stories. And I said, well, I like this whole thing. And I ended up going to Boston University for the School of Public Relations Communications. Came back here. My father was ill, so I ended up staying here, going on to McGill. And I was doing some local news stories, mainly student stories, university stories. And I guess it got into me, and when there was an opening available at CJAD for a news writer in 1958, 59, 57, it was that era.
I read your bio.
Okay, I started writing news. I dropped out of university, and I started on my occupation. From writing, I became a reporter at the beginning of '60, and moved on from there through reporting to administration to management to building a radio station in Ottawa, coming back here to run Muzak for Eastern Canada, which most people know about what Muzak was, not what it is. It was a one-channel operation, became a 30-channel diversified music operation, using satellites rather than landlines. And then the occasion arose that Mr. Slate, who was by then was the, I guess he was the fourth owner that I knew of CJAD, said he wanted to sell that part of the business. It was only $3 million, the small part. Did I want to buy it? Now, I had right of first refusal because that's one of the conditions that I took over. Well, I said, 58 years old, do I want to invest everything I have, put my family in jeopardy? I had no sons who might take over that kind of business. So I said, no, I don't want to. But the people, the financial people who were involved said, you have to make an offer. So I made what you call a skunk bid, figuring, well, if I get it, at least I don't have to kill myself financially. Well, I didn't get the skunk bid, but at least it showed that I knew what I was doing. And Mr. Slate said, well, we think you should find a buyer. So I did. I found the buyer called Chum, the people in Toronto. They bought it. And I was supposed to stay on. And then they changed their mind. So I took my retirement, and I've been pretty happy ever since.
Okay, good. You have three very intelligent daughters who are all very successful in what they do. One of them, your youngest, Melissa, sent a question going back to the threatening times that you worked in. You never felt that way during the October crisis? You never felt threatened during the October crisis or scared?
I personally didn't, although I think some members of my family, my brother-in-law was worried one night, even came over to the house with a machete, allegedly to protect his sister, my wife. No, I wasn't personally worried. Maybe I should have been. We had a police patrol in the town of Mount Royal, and I was on the patrol list, the watch list, because I was 4 blocks away from Barrasa's house and Bill Tetley, who's then a cabinet minister, and a couple of judges. So the police car did a route, and I was on the route. No, I didn't. You know, in hindsight, I could have said, yeah, what kind of idiot were you? But on the other hand, in those days, I guess I felt fearless. I don't know.
Okay, we have more questions that have come in, and folks, if you do have questions, just please raise your hand in the chat, or you'll write the questions in the chat. This one is, what radio station do you listen to now? Having worked at CJAD for all those years, so much as
well,
since
that's a good question. I don't listen to radio as much as I used to, obviously. I listen to Andrew Carter in the morning, and sometimes to Aaron Rand at the end of the afternoon. And that's basically my radio listening. I watch much more television than probably the average person, and I watch more news, probably more than the average person, because it's still in me. Although someone's going to ask, do you feel you want to be there? Not anymore. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed what I did. It was a great challenge. At the beginning, after I retired, I felt, I could always do better than what I hear. But on the other hand, you have to leave room for new people to make their way.
Did you ever feel that way when you took a vacation, that you were missing something and that your replacement wasn't going to be able to do the job that you could have done?
Well, I don't think.
You're breaking it. Sid, you just muted. We all just did, I think. Sid? Something's happened here.
I have a feeling it's his earpiece.
Hold on. Sid, can you hear me? No, he can't hear me.
Let me
hold on.
I'm gonna text him.
Well, actually, you know what? I'm just gonna give him a call.
Just hold up a sign to the monitor.
Yeah. Yeah, he's being told now. I think your earpiece died, Sid. Answer your phone. I'm calling you. Oh, there. Okay, I hear you on the phone. No, you just hung up on me. Okay. We are on with Sidney Marglese. I think a battery died maybe in your headset, Sid, because we can't hear you right now. So is there a way to go just through the computer and turn off your your Bluetooth attachment? I believe that's how we can.
Is this one working?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you. Just back away a little bit because it's a little bit tinny.
Okay. So I don't know where I got cut off, but
You got cut off kind of at the beginning of that answer.
well, as I say, when you needed to recharge your batteries, so I knew I had to go on vacation, and my replacements were all competent people. Tom Armour initially used to replace me for a couple of weeks, and then Rick and Peter were covering news as well, so they had to spread out a little more if I wasn't there.
You described yourself pretty much as a news junkie still to this day. Would you also describe yourself as an adrenaline junkie, running out to the scenes and being the first one there?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the term adrenaline junkie, but certainly I didn't keep track of the time that I worked. I felt I had a job to do, and that was one of the things that I made a deal with the late Mac McCurdy, who was then the general manager of the station. I said, listen, you don't have to pay me. Don't consider overtime. Pay me a good salary and I'll work as necessary. And that's what I did. And I put in crazy hours some weeks. You may recall I had a program each week for a number of years with Robert Bourassa. Well, that program, even though it aired on the weekend, was normally recorded on Friday. Sometimes on Friday in Quebec City, and sometimes in Montreal, and in Montreal sometimes as late as 11 o'clock at night on the Friday night at his house, because I'd have to wait until he came from Quebec City. And then when I would meet him, he always insisted on watching the 11 o'clock news, and then we would record. The same thing, I had a program every week with Jean Drapeau. And there too, most of the time, the program would be recorded on Fridays, usually first thing in the morning. Because with Drapeau, if you took an appointment later in the day, the chances are it was going to be late. He never was on time as the day progressed.
Yeah, we can all relate. No, we all go to doctors. We can
okay, but with Drapeau, if you started at 8, you had an 8 o'clock appointment in the morning, chances are he was there at 8:05, 8:10, because he would be in the office at 6 o'clock. So that program was normally Friday, but there were sometimes I'd do it on Sunday morning. I'd meet him at the City Hall Sunday morning at 9:30. We'd record the program, record it live to tape, and it would be rebroadcast at 12:45. So I would end up working, people thought 7 days a week, not always. So
one of the things you described to me as we were preparing for this was how sometimes you actually had to go in the car with Drapeau and do the interviews all the way to Quebec City. How'd you get back?
Well, actually, on the way to Sorel, with one occasion. During the October crisis, Bourassa had a temporary headquarters at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel. And so I would come up to the hotel Friday evening to record the program for broadcast on Saturday. Well, one Friday evening, the news was changing so rapidly because of certain events, and I don't recall specifically which ones, but I do remember him saying, "You'll have to come with me to Sorel. I'm supposed to meet my in-laws and my wife there." And I said, "Well, how am I going to get back?" He says, "No problem. You come with me in the car. I'll have one of my guards take your car and follow us and head to Sorel. And when we're finished, you'll get in your car and you'll go back home." I said, "That's fine."
Yeah, that definitely.
We're driving in his limousine down the roadway. Little did I know that the policeman had inadvertently turned on my transmitter in the car. So at CJAD, the newsroom would hear all kinds of noises, siren every so often, because they were clearing the way in front of us. They didn't know what was going on for about 20 minutes. When I finished recording with Morasa and got out of the car and came back into my car, I could see the little light was on, showing that the transmitter was on. I turned it off and I could hear the guys screaming from the background, Sid, where are you? What's going on?
Wow.
So I got on and I had to explain what had occurred. The public didn't know.
With those crazy hours, how did you find and sort of manage a work-life balance raising 3 young girls at the time?
You know, there are times that I regret that I didn't have the family time that many of my friends had with their family. But it's kind of strange. My late wife, Merle, grew up in a household where her father was a salesman who traveled a lot. So I guess to her, my absence was no different than when she was younger and living at home. And I guess my girls didn't know the difference. So we had the one rule we tried to do was have dinner every evening together, usually at about 6:30, not earlier, because I would be downtown and leave after the traffic was heaviest. So I'd be home at 6:30, have dinner, and then if I had to cover something, I would go out again. So we were always home around dinner time, and we had some interesting discussions around the dinner table, as my daughters will attest to. Do I miss having spent as much time with them as I think most other parents did? Yes. But you can't go back in time.
No, you definitely can't. There's another question from Asher, who's raised his hand in the chat. Asher?
Hi, thanks. Sid, I wanted to know, anytime during your career, did you ever report where Paul's world of expertise is, anything in the sports world?
I'm sorry, Asher, I didn't quite get that question.
He's asking if you reported anything in the sports world throughout your years in broadcasting as well.
No, not really. So I guess I was not an athletic type, and I guess sports didn't really mean that much to me as far as that goes.
And sports stories didn't really cross over into the mainstream then. I think really until Ben Johnson in '88 when he tested positive at the Olympics.
I think sport, actually the funny part is I started when I was in Boston at the university. I was covering hockey because they said, hey, this kid from Montreal, he must know hockey. So I was covering hockey for the university newspaper, and then I became a stringer, as you will understand, Paul, for AP. You had to call in 2 paragraphs, and you got paid $5.
Oof. But so then did you get to cover the Beanpot tournament?
No.
Well, that's the big one, right? Boston College, Boston University, when they played for the hockey championship every year.
Maybe he doesn't.
Sorry, somebody else had a question that they wanted to ask?
Eli here.
Go ahead, Eli.
Hi, Sid.
Hi, Eli.
Recently, I heard an interview with Rick Lechner, and he said that you gave him his biggest break. You were on vacation, and if you remember Sir George Williams University,
Yes.
and there was a riot, and he filled in for you. Would you like to comment on that?
I was not on vacation. I was in Ottawa at the time. I don't recall why I was in Ottawa, but I was in Ottawa at the time covering something. And yes, Rick was at the Sir George riot where they were throwing stuff out from the 11th floor.
Right.
He covered at the time. Yeah, there were a few big stories that I missed. I also missed the Bluebird Cafe fire, where there was much loss of life. I was on vacation, just coming back that evening when the fire occurred.
Wow. The missed ones are the ones that we remember, but certainly not the audiences. Your first big story, you had been telling me, Sid, we only have a couple.
Actually,
No.
My first big story, and I didn't realize how big the story it was at the time, was the kidnapping of Joel Reitman.
Mhm.
Now, for those people who don't know the name, Joel was the son of Cyril and Dorothy Reitman. I was writing news in the newsroom that Sunday night when I got a phone call from someone saying there was a problem in the town of Mount Royal. There's all kinds of police around. So I called the Mount Royal Police, and the director at the time, George Fischel, said, I can't tell you. If you call Bill Fitzpatrick, the chief of detectives in Montreal, he might fill you in. So little Sidney, 19 years old, calls Bill Fitzpatrick. This is CJAD calling, blah, blah, blah. Come on down to headquarters here. We'll fill you in. So I go down to police headquarters. This is 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. And he says, welcome, you're now here with us. I said, what do you mean? He said, we'll fill you in, but you can no longer leave us until the story is solved. I said, what are you talking about? Then two other guys were there, the late Al Palmer and Ray Drouin, who was a photographer. We were sequestered, whatever you want to call it, to stay there until the police could get more details and try and figure out how to recover young Joel Reitman. He was, I think, about 4 years old. He had been kidnapped by the maid. We were sitting around all night till the next morning when we all went to the Mount Royal post office to look for a ransom note. And the police went through all the mail and nothing was found. And during the day, we were with the police and they said, well, maybe we're going to have to put out a message. And I said, I'll volunteer to talk to our people to put a radio message out. So I called Mac McCurdy and I explained to him there was a little problem and he agreed. So that night, we escorted Dorothy Reitman up the fire escapes of the old Legion building, the back of CJAD, to the back studio. With everybody, whoever attended CJAD knows there was a back studio. And she recorded the message, but we didn't broadcast it. It was a recorded message to the maid to bring her son back. And the police agreed to wait they wanted to wait one more day to see if a ransom note would arrive. The following morning, there was no ransom note, so they said, okay, at 12 o'clock, broadcast the message. Now, we were working in conjunction with CFRA in Ottawa in those days, so we sent the tape on a telephone line to CFRA also for broadcast at noon. And sure enough, the broadcast was heard in Ottawa by a taxi driver who called police to say, I have this young kid that was left in my car.
Wow.
And to make a long story short, it was Joel Reitman who was abandoned by the maid, who got cold feet or whatever you want to call it. And so there was an exchange between police departments, the Ottawa police or Ontario Provincial Police, I don't remember which, drove to Hawkesbury, and the police from Montreal drove to Hawkesbury, made the exchange, brought the kid back, and came back to the house in town Mount Royal, and I was one of the three people of the media allowed into the house to witness the family reunion.
Wow, that must have been emotional. I imagine it was also, and this is the last question because we're already running over time, but emotional for you in 2009 when you were inducted into what I mentioned off the top, that you were inducted into the Canadian Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame.
Yes, it was emotional because in effect I was the only person from CJAD News and only CJAD personality at the time. I think Paul Reid may have been inducted in later on, I'm not sure. But to be recognized by your peers is the honor. Without saying, it's a great honor.
Well, it's a great honor speaking to you today in this atmosphere on Zoom with 46 other people who are watching today. And this will be available on the Shahrazad website, I believe, on the Facebook page afterwards. So Sid, thank you so much. Toda Rabah from everyone at Shahrazad for joining us today. This really was eye-opening and a great walk down memory lane and a great history lesson for all of us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sid.
everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Great. And if you want to talk to each other, schmooze, I guess we can leave the room open. It's up to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really enjoyable, Sid.
Thank you, Sid. From a Hampstead counselor to a TMR counselor, it's Abe Gunshore. Be well to everybody. Have a happy and healthy new year. We should only meet at good times like this. Hi, Paul, my dear neighbor, used to be my neighbor.
How are you, Abe?
I'm good. I'm
Amen.
good. Sid, this was it's wonderful. Be well, everybody. Paul,
Amen.
nice to see you, Paul.
Amen. That was really wonderful. And I remember, Sid, when you were a lot younger, even younger than that.
I remember your father when he was the mainstay of the Shahrazad Minyan.
That's right.
Well,
He
you
was
have to put it
he was one of
with
the
his
first.
cigar, when he had to
That's-
put his cigar out when he went inside.
He was called he called himself the Millionaire. The millionaire, but he was a millionaire.
You were terrific. I really enjoyed it.
Very good. Thank you again, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Take care.